I know what makes the arrows go slower
What's that?
on here. When the trash gets full, the more full the trash becomes, the more they slow down.
Okay, so it's fast now.
Now it's fast, yeah.
Oh, good idea. Because if it's with files that take up that much space, that's a good idea to have something like that. All right. We are studying cosmology. And currently we're studying the cycle of rebirth. And we have begun that study by looking at life here on Earth in the chemical subdivision of the physical world. And we're proceeding slowly and trying to enjoy it and pick up some useful things for practical spiritual living day by day. Now, so far we have noticed that there is a bidirectional revolution of consciousness which has a definite effect. When we begin life, we have only a future, and we turn our consciousness forward because that's the only way we can turn it. Eventually we have life goals and things like that which pull us forward even more. And the effect of turning our consciousness forward is that it is incarnating. And one of the effects of this is that our dense physical bodies become progressively more mineralized with age. And in our bodies we become, as the young people say in slang, old fossils. Now, somewhere along the way, as we reach or approach adulthood, we initiate a revolution of consciousness in the opposite direction. We begin to look backward. And if we are raising children, that seems to accentuate the activity. We can't help but to watch our children because they're so beautiful and they're our joy. Plus we have an enormous responsibility. I think when people start having children, they realize how little they really know. Krishnamurti used to say that everybody thinks they can be a parent, but I have never run into a parent that figured that they knew everything that was appropriate to know for raising a child right. The backward turning of consciousness is something that increases throughout life. However, the forward turning of consciousness gradually slows down and it wanes. And we've noticed so far, we're going to go into this deeper tonight, that the backward looking is disincarnating. And it turns out that if we have been doing this for a good part of our life, by the time we are old, our connection to the earth and even to our physical bodies is rather tenuous. We let go of more things one after the other. Now there are other forces and there are other factors in our life here on earth, but for now let's just stay with the incarnating and disincarnating forces. This is something fundamental and it's something universal. Now, that's a simple statement of it. There's much, much more to it. For example, it is that the two directions of consciousness are not symmetrical. In terms of volition and intention, they're definitely asymmetrical. intention in the whole process. Some of it is voluntary and some of it isn't. An infant has no intention for life, at least most normal infants. Its goals and its actions and its duties are put on it from without. The ones that love it draw it out into the world and give it goals, and that's part of a healthy development. Now, eventually, this forward-looking gets internalized and maturation follows its course, and we eagerly seek the things that we want to do in life. We have goals, all of those sorts of things. However, none of this is completely volitional and intentional. To most of us, a lot of the time, life happens. And we just flit from one thing to another. Whatever captivates us is it. Now, the forward turning usually doesn't come to be volitional, truly volitional, until late in life. When we come to know ourselves in such a way that we understand that something is our duty, and we willfully bring ourselves to do our duty, whether it is grossly unpleasant or not. That isn't always an easy thing to do. And old age has, in its own way, more courage than youth, because we do fulfill the duties that we have. Most people, especially young people, don't even like to plan, and they would rather have things just happen to them. Now, it's similar, but it's not quite the same thing when we start turning our consciousness backward. Infants, like little children, have no concept of a past or of history, even though they have remarkable memories. Their consciousness has not been distracted by the things of the world, and their consciousness has not been covered over by excess attention to matter, and so they have a very phenomenal memory capacity. It's one of those things that every parent that I've seen has thought these children are going to be really remarkable, and it turns out that they're pretty much like all the rest of us. That's because the parents are seeing this how would you say it, rebirth of early humanity. Before we fell and before we became highly materialized, we had all of these abilities. Early humans used to be able to chant poems that now take up an entire volume. Scriptures, things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And when they did it, it was in a sing-song kind of way. You know, when a child is at a certain age, they have that sing-song kind of consciousness. When they're talking, they're singing. And that's a recapitulation of earlier times. Little children remember in very great detail, and they echo things that they hear. And sometimes that's an embarrassment to adults because they don't have that social filter and they just state it outright. However, by the time that somebody has matured enough that they can have their own children, that innocent memory is lost. Somewhere in teenage, we lose that phenomenal memory and we lose that innocence. It's nice to see somebody becoming a young adult. They're starting to awaken in their desires and they still have some of that innocence yet. That's a beautiful age to see. So when we look at our children and we marvel at their consciousness and the effort that they put into normal development, when we're marveling at them, part of the marvelment is that we can't remember that in ourselves. We've forgotten all of that. So, the things that we do remember, the failures or the things we would have liked to have done, we sometimes try to regain them in our own children. And that's very nasty thing to do to little children. They should have their own things. Now, in doing this, we muffle our children. And if maturation isn't enough to close off the past innocence, loss of spontaneity that is in children is plenty much more. All right. Like turning our consciousness forward, turning our consciousness backwards may also not be free and intentional. Depending on what we have made of our psychology, we tend to romanticize the past, and we gloss over even crucial events. We produce masking memories because they're more pleasant to remember than things that we don't really want to remember, even though it would be good to do so. And then turning backwards has other problems because we destroy neural cells. And to bring some memory through into consciousness becomes impossible. Now, when we are turning our consciousness backwards, we're going against the grain. We're swimming upstream. So when we're doing something like the retrospection exercise, in order to glean information out of past experiences, we meet with a double resistance. On one hand, it is just that as we have just said, we're going against the flow of things. Everything wants to go forward. And so we're doing something mildly unnatural. And that's pretty much par for the course, because in many ways, the spiritual life is counter to the natural life. The natural life just flows and follows along, and there's not much growth in that. It's easy to follow what is socially acceptable, and it's easy to think about tomorrow and not undo the results of the things that you did yesterday or today. So it's a tough thing. The other part of the difficulty in doing something like retrospection is that the unconscious part of our being resists being tamed. And so there is a psychological resistance rather than a natural resistance. There's yet another resistance, but it's off topic too far. So we are divided beings. And part of that division, the part that exercises control over some of our memory and some of our other psychological functions, is unconscious to us. And it's not readily acceptable unless we have a great will and a great desire to face and see what we have done and to redeem things from the past. Now, in all of this, we can see whether turning our consciousness forward or backward, we're not completely free. This is what the spiritual life is all about. Yeah, there are higher worlds and higher faculties, and they're wonderful. But they're not something that is completely divorced from our consciousness the way it is now. Our consciousness and our vehicles of consciousness are the expressions of those worlds. We experience them every day. What we want is we want to be free people. And we cannot be free in any wider sense unless we are aware and in control of what we already have. We're not free from reality to escape in some higher worlds. We are free within reality. Our lives are the great experiment that the alchemists talk about. And our bodies and the way we use them and develop them are the experimental apparatus. All of us, all of humanity is involved in this same work. The only difference between a spiritual aspirant is in the intensity and in the care of application of self to life. All right, that's the sermon for tonight. I get a little preachy once in a while. Now it seems apparent from what we've just been saying that there are different powers and faculties for these two different directions of consciousness. They are, roughly speaking, reason and memory. We reason, we plan, we plot, we imagine forward. We recall or remember when we turn our consciousness backward. These things seem to be simple and obvious, but I'm not so sure of that. The only thing that I have any surety about is that it is that I'm in something now that I'm in over my head. The first question in dealing with this is, where do we begin? It's sort of like facing a subject like this is like facing the bartender in an old Western movie when he says, "Name your poison." So we're going to begin by looking backwards, or looking at the consciousness, which means memory. The reason for beginning with memory is that what has happened and what is happening now, which we will assume will become memory eventually, is fact. The future is not fact. The future is not so certain as the past. Now, I have pondered the subject of memory for many years, and this is about the fourth time that I'm trying to share my ponderings. And each time has proven to be a dismal failure. And there's no reason to think that this presentation is going to be any different. However, if we don't try something, we can't possibly ever learn anything. Can't possibly ever do anything without trying. The first and simple question is, what is memory? Now, at this point, it seems important to mention that we're going to speak about memories, remembering and recalling, and those are two very different things, remembering and recalling. They can come later. We're just going to talk about the memories tonight. They might even not be in this series that we talk about remembering and recalling. Now, it also seems to be important that this is going to be one of those little side trips that we take. It stays closer to the main subject, and it isn't so long, so it isn't really bad. So please bear with it, because these are things, that I'm the kind of person that needs to know why things are as they are. There was a time that I used to not want to go to sleep, or I'd almost go to sleep crying because I needed to know why things are, and I'll go to great lengths to try and understand why they are as they are, whether I'm successful or not, or if I have the equipment to do it. It's something that I do, so you'll just have to bear with me. I'm at the age now, and with sufficient practice, which isn't a great deal, I'm at the fringes that sometimes I can get into the personal etheric memory. And I can get into those pictures that are so fascinating, or the world that is so fascinating. But I have all kinds of questions as a result of it, so that rather than having less questions about memory than in earlier times, I have more. But some of the things that I conclude sound a little crazy. Now, after all of these years, to describe memory, the best that I can do is say that memory is the duration of a life expression. Probably better, memory is memory is the duration of a life expression. Now that may sound weak and vague and lame, and it probably is. It doesn't even sound like a definition. And it's going to take a lot to talk about what I mean, because this is something very vague and something very different. You know, if you have an object before you, you've got that object you can look at and measure, and everybody can perceive it. But when you have something like memory, which is almost in another sphere in some ways, and something that is quite abstract, it gets crazy to try to deal with it. We don't necessarily need to define it anyway, because the experience and the understanding is more important than having a nice, neat definition. Now, this description of memory is in terms of time. It could very well be stated in terms of space. And in such a case, it would be like a memory is the form or a form of a life expression. Now, it becomes clearer if one differentiates the experiencing of memory from the memory itself. A memory is a memory when it is used as a focus of consciousness. It is a means to conscious experience. Direct or immediate experience is when we're with something as it happens, when the memory is being made. And this implies time, which is what some people think of when they're thinking about memory. They're thinking it's something of the past. But if we want to understand memory in a more subtle, in a more spiritual sense, we have to understand it in a different manner. Now here, in this three-dimensional external physical world, we have an extremely limited sense of time. And in the higher spiritual worlds, it's a lot different. Because the scale and the quality of time is so different in the higher worlds, some make statements like, there is no time at all. And relative to what we experience as time in this world, that is apparently true. Relative to those worlds, it's a different matter. It's so different that it requires a different kind of language and it requires a different kind of understanding. For example, some people who have conscious functionality in the inner worlds, or even if it's little glimpses here and there, they can see events that are coming into being. And when they see events that are coming into being through the ethers, they say the experience is like remembering. They say they remember the future. Now, this is something that you can prove for yourself. Now, if you're fortunate enough and dedicated enough to live a life in such a way that you can function while your physical body is asleep as an invisible helper, you can prove it to yourself. Usually, most invisible helpers that are ordinary people like ourselves have a semi-conscious waking state on the other side, in the inner worlds. However, if someone does a spiritual exercise, especially like the morning concentration, if somebody does that at the moment of awakening, if after you do it for a few months or a few years, it becomes part of your general consciousness. And there is an anticipation of coming into your consciousness, and before you move or do anything else, to focus on something that's coming into being from the past, you can transfer your consciousness, your waking consciousness, back into that realm from which you just came. And what happens is you anticipate that exercise before you enter your body. And when you're anticipating trying to transfer your consciousness back to where it is right now as you're coming into the body, but you do with full waking consciousness, that anticipation has you more awake in the inner worlds than normal. And when you come through the ethers, just before coming into your body, you're likely to be picking up things that are coming in through the ethers in the future. Often it's anxiety or curiosity or something like that that draws us to pay attention to them. But actually what happens is you actually begin to recognize that some things are of the future and some things are of the present and some things are of the past in the ethers. But they're there with the same quality about them, and you can see them, or you can intuitively discern which is future and which is past. And you have to be careful about this, because there's always a danger of wanting to look at things that pertain to yourself, and that kind of selfishness is a violation of the ability to serve as an invisible helper, which is supposed to be completely altruistic and done for the sake of others. So this is another reason why it is important to be an altruist if you're on the spiritual path. Otherwise you get led astray into all sorts of things of personal interest. Now, while I'm being preachy, and this is a rather preachy night tonight, it's a good thing to talk about another thing about life here on earth. People here feel attached. Let me think about it a different way. Most people here are attracted to spiritual things, and when they are, they feel the pinch of limitation. This world is hard and it's tight and it's not something that we feel free in. And most would just as soon detach from their physical body and fly off into the spiritual world. And they don't realize that to do so consciously without being prepared would be to be extremely disoriented. And it would even be a dangerous activity. You have to grow into that kind of activity. You have to become a denizen of the higher worlds. And that is accomplished by graduating from the world. That is by thoroughly living our lives and all the lessons of the world before we can do that. All right, end of second sermon. Now, to some schools of what's happening with me is I get involved with interesting topics and things that you can do with them and experiences you can have, but I feel in order, once I have done that, it's my duty to give a warning for all the moral precepts that have to take place before it can really do that. All right. Some schools of thought look at this world, the chemical subdivision of the physical world, as a graveyard, a place of death, and some even see it as a punishment. And even some of Christianity is misinterpreted it. Even like the statement, let the dead bury the dead. People take that to mean that this whole world is a dead place. It's much better and it's healthier to look at this world as a proving ground. This material world is as far into materiality that we can carry our endeavors. And it has the unique quality of being the end of the line. It is not interior to anything else. It is almost singularly exteriorized. And this characteristic of being the end of the line, as outward as far as you can go, has a quality of finality. And some people interpret that finality as death. If I sever the root crown of a plant in my garden, it is the end. And that's the way living things relative to the limitations of this material world, there is that kind of factual finalization. And since we have this kind of a view of time, each moment we understand is of universal importance. So if we begin to understand living life for the sake of life, and we can enter into life with concentration and intensity and sincerity, we can expand each moment so that each moment spreads out and into what is called the past and into what is called the future. We can only prove ourselves by our fruits, by the life that we live. If we are not, as a result of our spiritual endeavor, if we are not better people, and if we are not unfolding faculties, it means we haven't really put in work. All right, now it's time to get back to the hard stuff. To try to understand memory in this tentative definition of memory as the duration of a life experience or as a form of a life expression, let's begin here on Earth, the planet and the stuff, as the end of the line. In doing this, we're being classical and we're using the macrocosm, we're using the Earth itself. Now, the first thing we note is obvious. The duration of the life expression that we call the planet Earth is not done. The Earth is still here. We use it every day. It's still evolving. Now, that might seem a very silly thing to say, childishly silly. It isn't, because it brings us to become aware of different grades of life expressions, of different grades of memory. When the Earth, as a physical body, is no more, only then will the memory be total. Now, there's a temptation to call that, instead of total, to call it absolute, but that gets into all kinds of linguistic problems. So, right now, the memory of the Earth is relative. And there are many degrees of relativity of the memory of the Earth as it is expressed in the Earth itself. Remember, we're trying to differentiate between the object and the memory of the object, even while the memory of the object is, how would you say it, concentric, or what's the word, that the congruent with the object. Now, before going into this, I want to take a little side trip into an ironic paradox that is filled with possibilities of juicy speculation. We won't go into any speculations, but I'll just mention the paradox. It is that the memory of the Earth is total and it is complete. It can no longer be part of the Earth itself. I don't know how to say it. This is so hard. Let's just say it simply. When the memory of the Earth is complete, it can no longer be part of the Earth because the Earth is no longer present. Meaning to say that Earth, as we know it now, as a solid chemical thing, isn't always going to be here. Now, this has to do with cosmological principles of creation that are way too far removed from what we're doing now. For now, it's just sufficient to indicate that there's a difference between something and the memory of something, even though the memory of that something might be with the something itself. This analogy applies to people. Who is it? Mark Twain that said that the rumor of my death was greatly exaggerated. It's something like that, that the memory of our body or of the life expression in our body is not complete until the body is no longer there. But there are memories in our bodies. A scar, I've got a scar here, that's a memory. And I have bad posture, so in my psychological makeup from very young on, I did something to my fascia, the connective tissue, so I have bad posture. But they are relative and incomplete, and they even disappear when only there is the complete memory in its place. Now that's kind of ironic. We can't remember something until it isn't possible to experience it directly. Now, when I was in my early 50s, maybe even 50 itself, I did one of the hardest physical things I've ever done. I hiked down the South Kaibib Trail to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And I walked along the Colorado River, I think for a couple miles. And then I walked back up the Bright Angel Trail. And it was at least 26 miles. And going down wasn't so bad, but coming back up was, well, it was such an exertion that when I finished, I cried. When I took that last step, I was crying because it was, you put a lot in it to do it. And I began at dawn, and it was early in July. In that Koepsel Peninsula, the grass was already dead, and the sun, rising sun going through the grass made it look like there was, like a yellow haze, a golden yellow haze. And then you looked, and there was that darkness that was the canyon itself. And so I went into that darkness, and I went into it with the sun. And the juxtaposition of diurnal time with geological time was mind-opening. It caused me to think about the different things that are going on simultaneously. So it took me just about a half a day to get to the bottom. And in 1/2 day of diurnal time, according to the signs along the way, I had gone through 1 billion years of history of the earth. When you get to the stones at the bottom, there are no longer layers there. That's all, what do they call it? Metamorphic rock that has been melted down, so that for the most part, any record of geology is lost. Now, along the way, there were animals, deer, small mammals, there were turkeys, and all kinds of birds and reptiles and things like that. And then there were those other animals, the ones who left their forms behind, the impressions of the life expression in the rock as fossils. And these were memories within memories, because the strata that they were in were themselves memories of what had been happening in the earth. And it really causes you to ponder how amazingly collective and complex and beautiful just the memory of the earth is without all of the experience of it. And I've always been fascinated how geologists and paleontologists and evolutionary biologists, the things that they can conclude and describe from very, very little pieces of information. It's wonderful what they can deduce. In some cases, they aren't always correct, but they do extremely well. Only the mystics who can read the memory of nature can go more deeply and more accurately into describing things that the geologists would never even consider. Now, we began this little side trip by saying that turning our consciousness backward into memory, we're dealing with fact. We're doing more than that. We're following a line of consciousness as an expression of life, and that line of consciousness clearly has a logic, and it has a consistency, and it is its own special factual set. And these facts that are suspended in a consistent stream of consciousness constitute a kind of a truth. So a memory in this sense is a kind of a truth. And when we're following that stream of truth, we're experiencing it anew. Now, the primary difference between this process And the initial delineation is direction. We're following the line of truth to its source. We're turning our consciousness backwards. And we're turning our consciousness backwards over facts. It works in us too, because everything in our life is a fact, and it's all tied together by a kind of logic. So when we turn our consciousness backward to our children, from infancy to adulthood and beyond, we know that we're doing that, but there are some differences. The children are alive, so we're watching a living process in action. Also, watching our children is less of a frenetic activity. So only a few parents, even though they watch their children, ask life questions and ponder the principles or anything like that. But another difference, which is both positive and negative, is that we have something at stake in the process. It is personal. Being a life expression, it has a will of its own, which isn't always harmonious with our own personal view of things. Now, in comparison, despite the lack of complete evidence, and geological records are far from complete, reading the geological memory of the Earth is itself simpler. Facts are like that. Having factuality makes interpretation much easier, because if you don't have your facts clear, it's hard to follow things back to their source by deduction. With a child, we don't even know what's coming next often. They surprise us all the time. Even as older people looking back at our lives, there are always things that distract us from looking at a full record of ourselves, because there are new things that are still happening yet. We're still moving forward. We don't have that same kind of finality. And because it is our life and we have something at stake, it's very hard to have that kind of objectivity. It's like coming out of the Grand Canyon, there is satisfaction. A satisfaction in completion. When we are turning our consciousness backward, especially when we're following a logical stream, we are passing from consequence to cause. Big, big, important thing. There's no doubt about something. If you have indigestion and you think back to what you had for dinner, there's no doubt about it. It's a fact. You're going from the consequence to the cause behind it. And sometimes you can even get at the psychological cause that goes even further behind it. And when we see events from consequence to cause, as well as having experienced them or knowing them from cause to consequence, there is an experience of completeness. Like coming out of the Grand Canyon, there is a completion. And when you have that, any experience, when you have seen it both forward and back, you have a feeling of a whole about it. There is a spiritual, intellectual comprehension of it. Now we're here for experience. And our life expressions are means to experience. And when we experience the whole of something of it or in it, it becomes part of us. Because it is, we often say that we're absorbed in a subject matter, but when we have absorbed ourselves into something that we can see it from consequence to cause after having experienced it from cause to consequence, it is absorbed into us. With the whole, the experience of a whole, there is that aha moment. And that aha moment means that it has been spiritualized. And we, who are the seers, who are the doers, who are guiding our thoughts and our perceptions, have taken something into us, and nothing can take that away from us because we know it. It's as much of a fact as having eaten ice cream and pickles together and having a stomachache. This is why putting ourselves into our lives is important, but also being able to, with the same sincerity, re-experience it as though we were someone else, objectively seeing it from beyond. This is a very, very potent spiritual activity. This is why retrospection is so important. Now, if we continue to follow the memory of the earth to the beginning of the chemical earth, we find ourselves in a place very similar to that ironic paradox that we mentioned earlier. When there is no earth, but still a memory of the earth. Here we go back to where there is no earth, and we've run to the border of the memory. Now, if we think about it, and it's the same thing with, if we retrospect our entire life, we know that the earth had to come from somewhere. Things don't just come out of nothing. There had to at least have been a potential there before there could be an actual. Not having at this time, not having time at this time, we have to be very abbreviated about what we say here. But this forces us to conclude that there is a causality that is active in the chemical physical from which the chemical physical was precipitated. We cannot go back from facts to when we go back to the beginning of something, we can't help but to know that there is something beyond the physical, and that it is something more subtle, more rare, something more spiritual. It's something that our senses, it goes beyond our senses. Now this, in mysticism, is referred to as vertical causality, as opposed to following from consequence to cause and then seeing that cause as a consequence of something earlier. That's horizontal causality. Horizontal causality occurs when you stay within one realm, within one world. Now we're probably going to do a sub-series on the varieties of causality somewhere along the line in these talks on cosmology, but we can't do it now. For now, we just want to make one simple point, that the turning of consciousness backward, the revolution of consciousness backward, not only brings us to absorb the essence of what is experienced, and by being re-experienced, it brings it into the spirit. It logically brings us out of our spiritual blindness. We're talking here that we're talking about age, the wisdom of the aged. That when we look back from the aged perception, we have more of that meaning of all the things that have happened in the various substreams of life that has contributed to our flow of life. The looking back causes us to see more so-called invisible things contributing to our lives. Now there's another effect of turning consciousness backwards, but it can only be mentioned because there's not enough time to develop it. And that is, if done deeply and thoroughly, remembering not only extracts the essence of the complete experience, it dissolves the memory and even the medium of the memory. The essence still remains, but the medium and the stuff of the memory are gone. Now, this is why we put all this talk about the geological earth. As Christian mystics, we know that it is ultimately our duty to relieve Christ of the burden of this earth. When we have enough soul material, we can float the earth, and in that soul material we have the intuition and the sense of spiritual dead reckoning to guide it through space in our evolutionary future. But it is not going to be the same earth that we know now. It's going to be an etheric earth. It is the new earth which the Bible tells us comes down from heaven. And from things like the Rosicrucian philosophy, we know that every time we do something from the goodness of our heart, we bring in a little bit more of that new earth. And we're doing our part of transforming life spirit into etheric stuff. Every Sunday, in this very same room, we are working at bringing down the new earth. We are taking life spirit and bringing it into an etheric panacea. Now, it's almost impossibly hard to think of it that we are thinking life. We're thinking vital life. But nobody ever said that the Christian work was an easy work, or that trying to live a spiritual life is something easy. Sometime, somewhere, we have to learn to think life. And we have to have the life spirit, that wisdom from which to draw it. And there's no better motivation than to relieve suffering. So that's pretty far-fetched. But as far-fetched as that is, it's still only half of the work. And the other half is that the old earth has to be dissolved. And has to be dissolved with nothing lost. This means that individually, but especially collectively, we must retrospect the earth itself. We must retrospect it into dissolution. Now, the Bible describes the dissolution of the earth as happening in a flash of fire, but that's no contradiction. It merely focuses on what the phenomenon looks like, not on the meaning that is within that phenomenon. Things like this are only done or best done volitionally. We'll do much more when we can do them freely. And when we're doing things not for ourselves, but for the Christ's sake, it's how we accomplish things like this. So literally, if we're doing our memory work in our own little lives and for the earth, we are doing something for the Christ's sake. All right, that's as much as I was able to put together. We'll continue on from here next time, though by then everybody will have forgotten everything. There'll only be one more talk, and that'll be the end of it until next fall. One more astrology and one more of these. Yes?
This topic about the etheric earth, I've just been thinking about. Now, will the Hubble's telescope eventually see an etheric planet?
All of them are. They're not planets. They are all of the stars. They call them plasmas. And a plasma is a concentration of energy that it's probably only the, what they're seeing in the telescope is probably only the, like the kinetic energy. And they're not looking at the life ether or the higher ethers beyond that. So all of the stars, but probably none of the planets. So you're already thinking of telescopes with etheric vision.
Yeah. Because when this Earth does indeed float and go etheric, does that mean the whole universe is?
As I understand it, it is not just an earthly activity. I think the whole solar system does it. I can't speak about it. I can't speak about beyond the solar system. I have enough trouble with the Earth here. We'll leave those other things like intergalactic masters. We'll leave that to the Urantia book. You ever see the Urantia book?
No.
Oh, it was a big, thick book that had all kinds of mediumistic speculations. And they tried to base everything on like human hierarchies and things like that, rather than understanding things from a spiritual sense. This is the big problem. Why it's so hard for us to enter the spiritual worlds, because we think too much like this world, and it requires a totally different kind of thinking. And because otherwise you're 100% boggled 100% of the time. You have to be made new people. You have to, it happens to us now, little by little. We open up to more. But as far as I can see, in order to understand full reality, we've got a long way to go. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
You're up for walking, aren't you?